I can't deny the fact that media has played a large role in the polarization that we see today. Some of the large scale structural problems of the media sector are truly international and far reaching, and one of them is polarization. And I think the media needs to own that they've been a part of that.
Hey everyone, it's Disagreeing Well, the podcast about polarization, why it matters, what drives it, and what we should be doing about it. I'm your host, John Malloy, and when it comes to polarization, everyone seems to have a pet theory about its cause. Social media, politicians, economic insecurity, the list goes on. But no hit parade of polarization villains would be complete without talking about the media. But it's not always that simple. On one hand, media is often seen as sowing division, amplifying misinformation, and fueling outrage. On the other, it's also praised for defending truth, holding power to account, and keeping democracy alive. So which is it? Problem or safeguard, divider or defender? It's clearly a complex picture, and to help us make sense of it, I'm joined today by Bill Killorn, the Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights, an organization that works in Canada and around the world to strengthen journalism and defend press freedom. Bill, welcome to Disagreeing Well.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I have to, full disclosure to all our listeners, Bill and I used to work together in politics about 100 years ago, and we've kept in touch over the years. And I was fascinated when you landed in this position, and really welcome the opportunity to talk about the role that media plays in polarization and the work that your organization does to support them on it. But before we get into Journalists for Human Rights, tell us a bit about yourself and your background. And as I mentioned, you worked in politics, but give us the big picture and how you ended up in your current role.
Happy to, and I was interested to listen to the introduction to the podcast series you're doing here, and some of the common organizations that get blamed for polarization. I've had the opportunity to work for a lot of the ones you listed in the introduction, so can perhaps bring some different perspectives to this conversation. But I started my career actually at Journalists for Human Rights shortly after I graduated from university, but then ended up working at the Ontario provincial government, as you mentioned, with you, in a role that worked with the media of the province of Ontario and the government and the politics. So saw firsthand the role that the media plays holding government to account, the role that the media plays understanding, helping the government understand what the people of the province care about. And had a fascinating career there working with the Premier of Ontario. And then after that, joined Journalists for Human Rights. And after a brief stop at Rogers Communications, so I had the private sector experience as well. And for the last 5 years, have been working around the world with journalists fighting for human rights, but also good governance, increased scrutiny of government, and progressive public policy.
So tell us a little bit about what you did specifically at Queen's Park, because I think it ties into our discussion today.
My role, I had various roles, but for the majority of my career at Queen's Park, I was in the issues management department for the Premier of Ontario. And I think it's probably one of the least understood positions in government. Everyone knows policy, everyone knows press secretaries, but the issues manager is kind of the air traffic controller, needs to understand what everyone is doing. But our day was really dictated by the media, and my role was to prepare the premier and support the ministers and the ministerial staff with strategies and communications, key messages on the issues of the day, working on not only what the media was identifying or what the opposition parties were identifying, but also what we were identifying internally as issues that needed to be addressed and mitigated and communicated to the public. So it was both a proactive role working with the media and a reactive role working with the media, with the end goal of making sure the public was well informed, that the premier was well informed of the issues that were of public interest on a particular day, and that at the end of the day, the government responded well to those issues in a way that the public would be satisfied with.
But at its core, I mean, the things that gave you the nightmares, that caused you all the headaches were when something that the government had done went poorly, was misunderstood, a scandal happened, something came out that put the government in a bad light. So you basically were a firefighter. I'm sure we could come up with analogies that aren't as polite. That you had to deal with a mess that happened, whatever the mess of the day was.
Absolutely. And sometimes those messes were predictable and sometimes they were completely unpredictable. I think one example that I often like to point to is coming to work one day and the front page of the Globe and Mail was alleging that one of our cabinet ministers was a spy, and having to deal with that was not something that we were prepared for. And the paper comes out in the morning, and question period is also in the morning, and where the premier and the cabinet ministers need to answer questions from the opposition and then have scrums with the media to address that. So it is like fighting fires and on incredibly condensed timelines.
But the reason why I raise that particular aspect of it is that so often these issues, occasionally they're raised independently by the opposition, but they start with the media. You talked about that Globe and Mail story, and I guess that experience gave you some interesting insight into how the media operates. Because I'm sure there were days when, although you wouldn't really want to admit it, at the end of the day, the government had done something bad, had made a mistake. Someone in government had made a mistake. And yeah, the media, you might feel has put a little bit of a negative spin on it, but fair is fair. And there must have been other days when you were really, really frustrated with the media, with the way they portrayed a story, the way they tried to create a scandal, or the way they tried to keep a story going after the government had offered what, in your opinion, was a reasonable explanation. I mean, I take it I'm probably describing emotions that you felt most days.
Absolutely. I think there were certainly days where, particularly on complicated policy issues, where at the end of the day, I didn't feel, maybe, and we did take responsibility for it ourselves too, where I felt that, maybe we didn't communicate the policy well, that translated into poor coverage of the policy that caused problems for us. But also sometimes, that the media have an interest in ensuring that scandals are in the papers for as long as the public's interested in it, and that can be frustrating when you're on the other side of it, for sure.
I mean, it must have been interesting coming to your role, and obviously, I want to talk about the work that's done by JHR. But coming to that role with a view of the media, which is complex to use maybe a simple term. Well, I don't know, is that an oxymoron? Anyway, simply complex, but a view of the media that didn't see the media as necessarily always the group that was fighting for truth and justice, but at the same time, presumably you saw a positive role for the media. So what was how did you leave Queens Park? What was your sense of the media and journalists?
I think for the most part, while I was there, I had a very positive outlook on the media and a lot of respect for them, because I think our whole government respected what the media did, and I think we a couple things I like to point out is government, particularly for the province of Ontario, but I think it goes for any level of government. It's a huge entity, and there's a lot of things that go into that, and there's a lot that can go wrong. And when it's a massive entity like that, the government and particularly the political officials may not necessarily be aware. Even the civil service might be aware of things that aren't going great. And the media plays a really important role of helping to to identify things, either through investigative reports or contacts they have, to kind of bring that to the attention. And there's been lots of examples of positive things that media brought to the attention of the government that needed to get addressed. One thing that I often return to is the issue of lead pipes in schools. There was, I think, the Toronto Star did a series on that, and it led to a positive change that I think everyone would agree with. The other thing I think about with journalists is they're such an important part of any democracy, because the government can do all of the great policy changes that they feel are important, but if it's not getting to the public and the public aren't understanding it, it really doesn't help the government in terms of moving the needle, working towards reelection. So the media is the gateway to the public, and it's a two-way communication. It's the public letting the government know when they're messing up, and it's the government letting the public know what they're doing to try to alleviate problems. A great example is any budget from any government. The average citizen isn't going to take the time to read a couple hundred-page document outlining the spending of a government body, but journalists are going to read that. They're going to read it in detail. They're going to ask detailed questions, and then they're going to present that to the public. And the public is going to rely on journalists to weed out what is important in that 100-page document or multiple 100-page document. So I left Queen's Park just to wrap up, feeling very strongly that the media is a fundamental part of a well-functioning government, and that governments are best suited when they respect the role of the media and give them the time to answer their questions, because at the end of the day, the media really represents the public.
And do you ever look back and regret some of the frustration you may have felt by journalists that were digging into a story that was perhaps not flattering to the government? Because at the end of the day, with a little bit of distance, you say, you know what, it was fair that they were looking at something, and no government is perfect.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is absolutely yes. And I think even at the time while it was frustrating, I did have a respect for the journalists who were digging, identifying problems, not letting them go until they were satisfied with the solution. I think it takes a really skillful journalist to be able to do that, and journalists can drive public change. I think there's been times where an issue that has been identified by the media gets fast tracked through cabinet, and the solution can be implemented very quickly. And I think hopefully journalists understand the power they have when they're working with a government that respects the media, how large an impact they can play in the democracy.
But we've sung the praises of journalists, and I have many friends and former people I've worked with who are journalists. I'm still in touch with them, so they'll appreciate that. But at the same time, journalism, and certainly in your perch from Queens Park, but also where you are now as head of journalists for human rights, they can fuel polarization. As I said in my little intro, I think it's not very clear cut. It's complex, and I guess the question to you is, do you see that side of it, that they can undermine really a sense of unity and try to divide people and do it purposely?
Yes, I think that's it. As much as I can sit here and talk about the benefits and the importance of a strong media sector in a functioning democracy, it, I can't deny the fact that media has played a large role in the polarization that we see today around the world. And I think one thing that is really interesting about the media sector as well, each country has its own unique issues and its own unique problems. Some of the large scale structural problems of the media sector are truly international and far reaching. And one of them is polarization. And I think the media needs to own that they've been a part of that. And it dates back to the 1980s and looking at the US and the fairness doctrine that they had, which was a doctrine that mandated that any media entity that had a media license in the United States had to give equal time to different political parties and different perspectives of consequential nature. And in 1987, Ronald Reagan rolled that regulation back, and you can see a through line from that to the polarized media that we see today. It led to the increase of particularly far right wing talk radio, and then led to the same sort of perspective on TV, Fox News, where if you're watching or listening to those stations, you're only getting one perspective, and they're not getting a balanced point of view, and that leads to polarization. And it's not as we've talked about in the past. It's not solely a right wing issue. I think there are left wing media stations and left wing radio shows that are calling plays from the same playbook. I think there's some legitimate criticism to be placed on CNN. They're running the same plays just from a different perspective. To answer your question, the media has played a large role in the polarization of the public, and that's part of the things that we at Journalists for Human Rights are trying to address as we support media development around the world.
And it wasn't simply the elimination of the fairness doctrine. I mean, that gave the tools, I guess, for these niche media centers to be established. But it was also the fact that you had the rise of the internet, you had the rise of all sorts of different pressures on traditional media. I mean, people weren't looking for the evening paper to get their news; they had a million other sources, and that must have put pressure on media to somehow create an appeal to, we're going to try to get all the right wing viewers to watch us, or we'll get all the right wing viewers to watch us plus the left wing viewers who want to be outraged to watch us. I mean, how did that all play into what's happened over the past couple of years?
I think one thing that people around the world who work in the journalism sector will agree with is that the advent of the internet has had an existential threatening effect on the media sector. Reduced ad sales for I've had the fortune to talk to people who have been editors for big newspapers across North America, and they said it used to be the heyday of advertising sales. The newspaper was the number one place advertisers went. They didn't have budget crunches. They were able to fund really interesting investigative stories. And then as ad sales declined, they had to make cuts, and a good way to ensure readership or ensure listenership or viewership was targeting an audience that only wanted to hear one perspective, and growing that audience. And I think that played a huge role in the polarization.
And it's interesting, you've mentioned a few times, or just in passing reference, sort of this is an international phenomenon. I mean, people in Canada are obviously aware of the Canadian media landscape, and the US, and potentially a little bit of perhaps what's going on in the UK or the odd Western European country. But can you expand? I mean, is this something you find in all corners of the globe, that what used to be considered middle of the road media has found its niche, and we're going to be the left wing paper, the right wing paper, or news station, or what have you?
To some degree, it does depend on the country. I mean, in a lot of the countries where JHR works or has worked, we're dealing with emerging democracies who maybe traditionally had undemocratic leaders or authoritarian leaders, or even democratic leaders who were a little bit, more strong-handed. They haven't really had a free press. So it was a free press that was either state run or owned by friends of the state leaders who were putting out one particular perspective, the government's perspective, and then smaller fringe independent media that were trying to tell the counter narrative. Those, we deal a lot with polarization in those terms, where it's the government message versus independent media message, and that I think brings some issues too, because you want to try to find that balance in between where you can have perspectives. I do think even in well sophisticated media ecosystems, polarization is becoming an issue, and it's because it's a way to guarantee readership. If you're only telling people what they want to hear and reinforcing that, they're going to love coming to your newspaper every day and reading the stories. If you're not being challenged with different viewpoints, if you're just being reinforcing what you already believe, it's a good way to maintain readers, and then try to chase some advertising revenue as a result.
It's interesting. I mean, you mentioned, just to go back to your earlier comment, you mentioned the role that media plays sometimes in countries that aren't particularly democratic, and that sort of turns this conversation a little bit on its head, because we've talked about the role that media, chasing viewers, chasing readers, chasing dollars, can play. But for governments, in well, the media is a very, very useful tool for spreading its message, for vilifying their opponents, for making sure that the society sort of remains divided in a way, or doesn't get information in a way that helps them. So that must be, I mean, a ton of the work that you do. So can you give a sense of how authoritarian regimes use the media?
I'll give you a couple examples of maybe two different extremes or two different viewpoints. But we have a project that supports independent Russian and Belarusian journalists who are trying to counter a narrative that is being put out by the Kremlin in Russia and the Belarusian authorities. The work that they're doing is pretty challenging, because they're trying to get accurate information or counter information into a ecosystem that's completely dominated by state-run media. But again, this we talked about the problems with the internet, but the internet has also provided an opportunity for independent media to kind of counter that. And they've used different techniques, satellites or the internet or social media to try to introduce their journalism that offers a different approach. A story that I like to point to is we supported a journalist who wanted to write a story about, or wanted to tell the story about Russians fighting on the Ukraine side against Russia in that conflict, to try to show the Russian public that it wasn't a unified stance on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The challenge is, how do you get that story out to the masses, and when so much of the media is dominated by the authoritarian regime. On the other hand, we're just in the early stages of trying to establish programming in Nigeria, and there we've seen the independent media sometimes have much better journalistic practices, much better leads on stories of consequence than maybe the more larger traditional media sources have. And when I was there in November of last year, there was a story about an army general who was kidnapped by extremists in the north of the country. And the media outlets that were covering it were only the small independent media outlets, while the larger kind of media outlets closer to the state were not reporting that this had happened. And the reason was that they didn't want to show that the government was weak in that way. The challenge that we have at Journalists for Human Rights is supporting those journalists who want to get that accurate information out. And I want to stress accurate and balanced, because as we've talked about before, it's not just doing the same playbook as the authoritarians on the other side and just putting out one perspective. It's okay, here's what the authoritarian regime is saying, here's what our reporting sources are telling us, and then leaving it up to the reader to decide.
And do you ever work? I'm sure you do work with, call it state-run media, or media that is looking to distance itself a little bit from the government. Perhaps there's a regime change or something. I mean, do you try to work with that side of things?
I think our model is really, we want to bring as many people to the table as we can, and oftentimes that does include government officials. At times in our programming, we've even worked with the military and the police. One great example I'll give you is in South Sudan. We partnered with the Dallaire Institute to run some training for the military, and in South Sudan at the time, the journalists were so restricted in how they could tell stories that in order for a journalist to take a camera out onto the street to tell a story, they had to get a permit from the media authority and the military to go out and tell the story. So oftentimes that would take a couple of days. So in when you're talking about news, it's breaking, you got to get out there as soon as possible. Going through a bureaucratic process of getting permission to take a camera out into the street is not realistic. So we had this session with these members of the military, and just kind of heard from them, like, why are you nervous about the media? And one senior official stood up and said, when I see a camera pointed in my face from a journalist, to me it feels the same as if someone's pointing a gun at me. So we had to understand that that's the perspective that they were coming to the table with, and work from there to try to say, well, actually, media can help you do your job better if you understand where the threats are, or where the problems are. And what actually helped us is we ended up taking a collection of the leaders of the media authority in South Sudan to an East Africa media conference in Kenya, where they got to talk to some of their counterparts in other countries in the region. And their takeaway from that was, wow, we are the most repressive when it comes to journalists in the region. We have a lot to learn. And as a result, they created space for the media. And even in a country as challenging as South Sudan, the media sector continues to grow, continues to thrive. And in fact, in the last couple of years, the Media Authority has been reaching out to Journalists for Human Rights to help talk to journalists and government authorities on how to prepare themselves for what we hope is their first ever national election.
But that brings us back to the very, very important point you made about dealing with. I don't want to call them opposition journalists, but journalists that are not sort of part of the government sphere who are trying to be a lot more independent. And that is that they can't then take the view that, well, everything, the government media says everything the government does is good. Well, opposition media, everything the government does is bad. And I guess it's about finding that balance. And I mean, one of the ongoing, this leads to, I think, a question which is so complicated, but that's why we've got you here, is what is fair journalism and what is balanced journalism? And are they the two things? I mean, do we need journalists who are willing to hear both sides of the story? I mean, these are fascinating stories about these countries that are loosening up a bit, and presumably, though, with the understanding that, hey, the government side is going to be told, as well as perhaps some other voices that are out there, but not the understanding of, well, the government side is going to be shut out. So what is, in your opinion, fair journalism, and where does balance come in? What does balance even mean?
It's a good question. I should maybe preface it by saying that the work that we do at Journalists for Human Rights, it really is really broad. We work with a lot of different media ecosystems, and some are we're dealing with journalists who are very new in the role and didn't have the advantage of going to journalism school, and our programming in that sense is very much journalism 101. But then we also work in countries like Kenya and Tunisia that have very advanced media sectors where we run a little bit more broad programming on investigative journalism, data journalism, human rights journalism. But it all comes down to what you alluded to: what is fair and what is balanced. I think fair, and this is one of the things, you can ask 10 people and get 10 different answers, but to me fair journalism is journalism that, dealing with challenging or sensitive topics, gives the opportunity for all sides to be represented and state their case, one that is responsible in how they display the information, in terms of, you know, really understanding their responsibility of educating the public, and having the goal of, it is not the media role to, with the exception of editorials, but when we're talking straight news, it's not a news story's role to tell the media or tell the public how they should feel. It's their role to present the information in an unbiased way and allow the reader to make opinions. When it comes to balance, a big thing that is important for human rights reporting and for journalists for human rights is, not only are all sides represented, but are all aspects of a community represented in the story. And one big thing that's important to us is gender balance. You know, there's some countries that we work in where a whole newspaper could have could be full of stories that have, zero sources from women. Helping the newsrooms understand that there's a huge segment of the population that you're ignoring. It's not just gender, it's also other marginalized communities in the country, and telling topics that may be a little bit taboo, but at the same time, it is up to the journalists and editorial staff to choose topics that are relevant to the society, and we help to support those decisions as well. But in the end, we're not dictating what those stories are. We're really just providing the support.
Let me, though, explore this a little bit further. And maybe I'll take it in the Canadian context. So you do stuff in Canada. I'm anxious to get to that. This sort of fairness and balance. The COVID vaccines. During COVID, there are all sorts of media stories about the efficacy of vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. Is there sort of a mandate there that we should have had? We should have turned on the TV and seen a vaccine skeptic. If we had I'll try to pick as many hot button issues as we can. I mean, we had a debate in Canada a number of years ago about banning conversion therapy, where young people, I think the legislation sort of says under 18, I believe, they used to have therapy that if someone identified with the LGBTQ community, they could go to a therapist that would try to, you know, convince them not to, that sort of thing. That sort of therapy was banned. If you were going to have a discussion about it, or even just write a story about it, did you need to go out and find someone who was in favor of conversion therapy? I mean, where does the balance fit? Because it's easy to pick those, and I obviously pick them because they're hot button issues. But there are viewpoints which have made progress over the past number of decades, who 20 or 30 years ago would never have been given the time of day. Like, to what extent does a journalist have to bring some of these, I don't know if they're extreme, but maybe they're very, very minority voices on controversial issues forward?
So I'm going to try to strategically answer that question without weighing in on any any
Well, I
controversial.
chose
No,
I chose two I chose two really
no,
outrageous examples to prove the point, though.
no, but I'm just obviously just kidding around. But I think the question that you're asking gets at the heart of what I believe causes this polarization that we see in Canada and all over the world. Is that when it comes to controversial topics like you brought up, or even less controversial topics, but ones that still create a division in our society, is that right now the media plays a role in this, and certainly social media plays a big role in this, and we can talk about the various factors that lead to that. But the end result is camps are created, and that you're either on one side of the issue or the other side of the issue. It eliminates a kind of a gray area in between where you can discuss and say, try to talk to someone who has a different viewpoint, understand where they're coming from or why they arrived at it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but it also doesn't mean that you can't find nine other controversial topics that you may have the same viewpoint on. And I think what we're experiencing today with the polarization is that you just choose your camp, whatever your cohort in that camp feel about any controversial issue, you take that stance. And anyone who has a different viewpoint is your enemy, and you could never find any common ground with them. So I think the role that journalists could play is giving, not necessarily giving a platform just for someone to spew hate, but helping people understand why someone could reach those opinions in the first place. And if you're not willing to kind of address those, and we're never going to address polarization. If you're not willing to kind of sit down and have a discussion, I'm never going to agree with someone who has viewpoints on some of the issues that you brought up. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to try to understand why they arrived at those, so I can, we as a society can move to address them.
And I mean, I think some of the best coverage I saw during COVID was stories that explored why people were skeptical, and spoke with members of the medical community who were dealing with people, and sometimes they were identified populations, from certain groups that were refusing to get vaccines, and they were talking about the medical personnel were talking about their experience and where this came from and where the fear was coming from, and trying to understand it, as opposed to the people won't get vaccine, grandma's dead, they're murderers, it's awful, which I hate to say, it was sort of the mainstream media throughout much of COVID.
Yeah, and you're right. And COVID's a good example because there are lots of really good reasons why people and certain ethnic groups or minority groups might be skeptical of vaccinations. I think there's documented stories in the States about members of the Black population in the South United States being guinea pigs on experiments from the government. And then there's also a famous story about when the CIA was trying to track down Osama bin Laden, and they had pinpointed him to the house in Abbottabad, and they were trying to get confirmation. So they sent a doctor under pretext of doing vaccinations to try to get a DNA sample, and that story broke out in that region, and then now there's vaccination skepticism in that region because of that story, I think. And there's countless examples like that, and you know again, it's exploring that gray area, why people feel certain ways, and trying to have a conversation, as opposed to just that person's an anti-vaxxer, I don't want to have anything to do with them, or that person's for vaccinations, I don't want to have anything to do with them. We're on two different sides of the spectrum, and we're never going to agree on anything.
So you've told us about many of the programs that you run, about where JHR is active, but give us a little bit of an overview of what your overall goal is, maybe a little bit of a history of JHR. I think People would be very interested to know that it's based in Canada. This isn't the sense of Canada has a chapter of Journalists for Human Rights. We are the, I don't know if you use the term head office, but the founder. So, how did it come about? And then, what is the sort of the scope of the programming? But then the other piece is the work you do in Canada. So, if you can outline that.
Yeah, I'm happy to, because we really view ourselves as a Canadian success story, and certainly these days that's important to highlight. But we were started in Canada almost 25 years ago. Started with programming in Western Africa and Ghana, focused on supporting journalists to tell human rights stories. Over that period of almost 25 years, our programming has grown across sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa, the Middle East. We run programs, as you mentioned, in Canada, but also in Europe, and just opened our first office in Asia, in Manila. All of our programming is focused on supporting journalists to tell human rights stories. But we like to say journalism is a big topic and human rights are a big topic, and that allows us to do very wide variety of programming. We do a lot of programming on women's rights issues, a lot of programming on sexual health and reproductive rights. We also do programming on mis and disinformation. We run a project in, as I mentioned, in Europe, supporting Russian and Belarusian independent journalists to counter misinformation. We also just concluded a very successful project in South Sudan, supporting journalists to combat mis and disinformation. In Canada, I think there's a couple things that give us credibility as an organization. Number one, certainly being from Canada helps. Canada, and maybe this is something we don't really recognize as Canadians. We're very humble, but we have a fantastic reputation outside of our country. And I've sat in meetings. I was in Erbil, Iraq, meeting with an organization that is trying to counter extremism in elementary schools, and fascinating group doing fascinating work. But the leader of that organization said right off the top that I'm meeting with you because you're Canadian. I don't have time for organizations from other countries that want to support us, but at the same time want to invade us. So being Canadian helps in this work. But also, what helps us is that we also run programming in Canada, because we can't pretend that we don't have issues in Canada that need to be addressed, and that gives us credibility when we're meeting with new partners in countries all around the world, to say we also do the same thing in Canada. Particularly in Canada, our long-standing programming has been supporting Indigenous voices in the media in Canada. It has broadened since in recent years to include many marginalized communities in Canada, and creating opportunities for young journalists of marginalized communities to get fellowship programs in media outlets in Canada. We've also had a number of programming giving journalism opportunities for new Canadians, journalists who have been displaced for their home countries, to get fellowships within Canadian newsrooms. We've got a great one with the Walrus magazine, where we have a journalist from Egypt and a journalist from Afghanistan working on fellowships there, and I would encourage people to check out their stories. But certainly, there's lots of work to do supporting the Canadian media sector. I got to say, we do have a very strong media sector in Canada. I'm very proud of the media sector in Canada. Not to say that it doesn't need support and doesn't need help here and there, but I'm very proud of the independent and I'd say fair and balanced media that we have for the most part in Canada.
Now, you mentioned placing students or placing young people in fellowships, that sort of thing. But what else? Like, give us some sort of concrete examples of what a program might look like. And obviously, for the topic of this podcast, misinformation and disinformation is huge. So, if you're going to a particular area and you want to help journalists deal with misinformation and disinformation, what does a JHR program look like?
A key part of our programming, and this is another part that I'm proud of, and I think maybe separates us from the model of different international development organizations. But our programs are co-designed by local journalists or local civil society leaders in the countries we work in. Our staff are comprised of local journalists. Our programs are run by local journalists and local civil society organizations. So it's important to say right off the bat that we're not going in with Canadian solutions for local problems. We're very proud that our government sees a value in investing in international journalism development. So we kind of come in and work with them on issues that are important to them. And misinformation is one that is important all over the world right now, as we see, particularly foreign actors seeing a political advantage to sowing division within society. So our programming in South Sudan, for example, we partner with many media organizations, with the government, their media authority, and then also civil society organizations that in particular focus on technology and social media. And what we learned there was that there was a lot of misinformation being spread in the country about that came along tribal lines and trying to sow division along tribal lines. There's long history of conflict, tribal conflict in South Sudan that has moved online as well, and there's a lot of misinformation. And certainly, if there's an incident that happens in the country, there, fingers are quickly pointed at various groups, and trying to combat that misinformation, to get accurate information out, to try to prevent conflict from happening, is very important. So we brought all our partners together to design programming that helped journalists understand what misinformation looks like, understand that the goals of a lot of these bad actors is to get their misinformation reported by a legitimate media organization, because once it's there, it's very hard to counter, even if it's proven false. The old saying that a lie makes it around the world before the truth gets its pants on is very true in misinformation. So we run a variety of workshops for journalists to learn about misinformation, to learn about how to counter it. Another part of our programming is to provide story grants to help journalists educate the wider public about some of these topics. And so, what we do is we have a program where if a journalist has gone through our training, they can also apply for this story grant to do a little bit of more in-depth reporting, and their media house also gets a portion of that. So it's they have buy-in and skin in the game too. So it also helps guarantee that the story is going to be published. So that's become a new kind of plank of our programming.
I know you talk about the programs being put together locally, but do you bring in experts from Canada or elsewhere to help lead the workshops and discussion?
Absolutely, from time to time, and I talked about before bringing the South Sudanese officials to Kenya to kind of learn there, and time to time we do send Canadian journalists overseas if they have a particular expertise that has been requested on the ground. One thing that we also do is one of our board members, Peter Donolo, who was the director of communications for Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, he has done some training for us with government officials, government ministerial press secretaries, presidential press secretaries, on the importance of respecting media, on tactics to get accurate information to media. And I think what's a really important part of the training that he delivers is helping governments understand the value that media can play for them in understanding what the needs are of their people.
So I mean, that's a huge list of activities that you're involved with. Just to give a little bit more context, you have offices or people who work overseas as well. I mean, even though Canada is the base.
Yeah, Canada's the base, but we have offices. I'm going to try to list this off because we've just recently opened a bunch of new offices. But we have offices in the DRC, in Mali, in South Sudan, in Nairobi, Tunisia, Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, Lithuania, and Manila.
That's incredible. That's an incredible list and challenges, I'm sure, in each country. But again, although we sang the praises of Canada, I think media everywhere in the world is prone to manipulation, is facing pressures that are, I don't know, forcing, if that's the word, but forcing it perhaps to be polarizing, that sort of thing. So, what do you see as the future of media? What do you see the role of, and I'm going to put it in a Canadian context, what's the role of a citizen to keep the media on track, to try to make sure that it's serving the purpose of strengthening democracy and fighting polarization?
This isn't very original, but the first thing I'll say is supporting journalism that you believe in, that you feel is fair and balanced in your eyes, and supporting it as much as you can financially, either through a subscription, is important. I think we always have to keep in mind that journalism is an integral part of democracy, and I think in I started working in Journalists for Human Rights in 2020, and uh, I have to say that the wider public, I think, is appreciating more and more the role of journalism, as we've seen what happens in the absence of well funded good journalism around the world. I think the you know there's a reason why coup d'etats and authoritarians target media houses, newspapers, radio stations, television stations early on as they establish their regimes, is because they understand the value of controlling the message and the role that media plays in getting accurate information that counters the propaganda or the mis and disinformation coming from the state. So I would say, Canadians, we're in a very good position around the world. Countries are scaling back their investment in international development. Canada has to some degree, but not nearly to the extent of some of the other countries. And a lot of the countries we're working in, we're seeing like-minded organizations closing up shop. So we feel very grateful that Canadians are appreciative of the role of journalism, and that the Canadian government does as well.
Is there a role for citizens to hold journalists to account somehow? Obviously through the subscription dollars, or no eyes on the screen sort of thing, no clicks that are going forward. But what about the debate around the CBC or other news sources that they're too woke, too they don't have the viewpoints, that sort of thing? I mean, do you see those sorts of debates as helpful? Do you think journalists are open to those sorts of debates?
I think journalists are always open to debates. I think it's in their nature to be open and interested in any kind of challenging conversation. And I think that those conversations, I know, are happening in newsrooms across Canada. I think the best thing is, and you mentioned it, is if you don't feel that a particular media outlet is fair and balanced or is leaning too far one way or the other, the best thing you could do is search for a media outlet that does, in your view, produce fair and balanced media, and give them your viewership.
And I mean, there are a number of media outlets that have, most of them, I shouldn't say most, I think all of them, just online, simply online, which subscriptions are available, are wanted, which come at these things. Some of them, I mean, I'm not going to start naming names, we'll get ourselves into trouble, but some of them are conservative, some of them are progressive, but they're advertising that they're going to bring a voice that's missing from the discussion. And I sort of say kudos to them for trying it.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll say is something that I'm optimistic about is not just the traditional players in the media sector, whether it be Canada or internationally, but the kind of new independent media outlets that are using tools like the internet or social media to get their stories out. I'm very optimistic on the role that they're going to play moving forward. They have the ability to operate with much smaller budgets and have stories that are high impact. So I would encourage Canadians to also seek out independent media that is reporting in their community on local issues, or nationally on issues that don't get the coverage that they deserve. So I'm very optimistic in terms of the future of journalism on that front.
And what about the future of journalism and fighting polarization and upholding democracy? And we haven't strayed into sort of the topical issue of politics, but I mean, democracy seems under threat, not just in some of the countries that we've talked about where JHR is very active, but in Western countries, in certainly in North America, it's a constant refrain. So, are you optimistic about the role that the press is going to play in fighting this polarization and in somehow making sure that democracy thrives?
I'm nervous about it. I think there's some worrying trends that are happening in Canada too, where we're seeing political parties, abandoning the practice of providing a media bus so that journalists can follow them around the country. In Ontario, we have a party in power that is moving to remove the premier and ministers from freedom of information that reporters and media can get access to. So I'm worried about the trends of trying to isolate media from the democratic process. I'm optimistic that journalists will continue to fight. I think the role of polarization is a challenging one. I think as long as there's a financial incentive to have polarized content, it's going to be hard to combat that. I think Canada, a lot of people are looking at the way Canada is handling the media sector through the various support programs that we've set up. I'm hoping and optimistic that people will continue to recognize the importance that journalism plays in democracy, and that we'll come up with some progressive policy solutions to address that. But that's not to say that there's not alarming trends going on around the world.
And I guess that brings us back to the earlier comment about the role of the individual, both to support media that is trying to give us a better understanding of what's going on out there and not simply running to one side of the argument. But the other piece is putting pressure on our political leaders. I mean, I'm an ex-politician. I always say politicians are simple animals. If the public is outraged about something you do, you stop doing it. And I think it is a bit of a wake-up call to all of us to recognize the importance of the media and to press our elected officials to support it and to respect it, even though both of you and I have been there. And sometimes it's easy. The short-term strategy of dismissing it is easy, but in the long term, it has some really, really negative effects, particularly these days.
I agree with you, and I'd say, for my advice to anyone who at times is frustrated with the media or angry with the media, to just imagine what Canada would be like without a free press or without media, and then it'll help you recognize the value of it, because there are countries in the world that don't have that free press, and they get one message, and it's the government's message. And I'll just leave with one quick anecdote. The I was very fortunate enough to visit Syria shortly after the Assad regime fell, and I met with a formerly state-run newspaper, and there was a new editor in place, and was talking to him about what it was like trying to de-propagandize the media, the newspaper that he was working at. And he was saying it's incredibly challenging, because every article that gets submitted to his desk, the first paragraph is praising the government. And when you have an absence of a free press, that's what you get, is just praising the government, praising the decision, and no critical analysis and no balance or fairness in the coverage. So the strong media sector is just a fundamental part of any democratic society, and that's why I'm so proud to work for an organization like Journalists for Human Rights.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our discussion, to a wonderful discussion that's looked at the complex role that the media plays, both in unfortunately at times fueling polarization, but also working to stop it, and the important work that JHR is doing. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your work in really supporting such an important part of our society and our world, journalists.
Thank you for having me.
Next week, I'll be speaking with Shlomit Broder, CEO of Digital Public Square, a Canadian-based organization that works to build online spaces designed to connect people rather than drive them apart.
I am a person who aspires to peaceful coexistence, right? And I think that you could argue about the facts and the history, and then you could argue about the facts of now and sort of what is the outcome of what you want to get to and what is realistic. And again, I'm not saying facts don't matter. I just think that perhaps it's really important also to ground ourselves in sort of where we're going, what's the outcome, what are all the shared things that we want right now, and how do we get there?
You've been listening to Disagreeing Well, a production of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, federated with Wilfrid Laurier University, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Disagreeing Well is produced and edited by Lauren Kivenhoven, with additional production and promotional support from Hardika Ahuja. Our theme music is Stuck in Dreams by Kulikova, courtesy of Pixabay. You can find Disagreeing Well on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and please follow us there. To find links to each episode, show notes, and to learn more about the work of the Center for Public Ethics, you can also follow us on our free Substack. Thanks for listening.